Today I'm going to preview many of the questions you're going to encounter on your Unit 2 test. The test is divided into two parts with a total of 92 questions, including the 10 vocabulary matching questions. There are 5 reading questions, which are pretty much pulled from the extra credit reading quizzes, including the 2 that I posted on Sunday. These are now all open, although you can only get credit for taking the last 2. Most of the vocabulary words in this unit are pretty easy as long as you understand what terms like marginal, total, average, and diminishing mean. Sorry if this is going to prove confusing, but sometimes on the test I'm using definitions from your textbook, and sometimes I'm using definitions from the textbook that I use to teach this course. I've included those definitions, that is from my old textbook, in these slides. You can look at the other definitions of your textbook if you think you need to. Note that you will need to understand the difference between economic costs and accounting costs. Accounting costs are what I have to write checks for. Economic costs include opportunity costs. So, for example, if I don't pay myself a salary, I am incurring the opportunity cost of what I could have earned at a different job. Here's another set of vocabulary words, and still another. It's important, by the way, to understand the difference between diminishing marginal utility, which always, remember, declines with the second unit consumed, and diminishing returns, where the decline may not set in immediately. Diminishing returns refers to declining marginal physical product, not declining marginal utility. In other words, it is a supply concept, not a demand concept like marginal utility. Yeah, I wish economists would use more easily distinguished terms, but they don't, so these are the terms you have to learn. You also want to remember the difference between total revenues and total profits. Total revenues are price times quantity, or the amount of money that actually goes into a business's cash register. Total profits, which is what really matters, are total revenues minus total cost. If you completed the food court simulation, you should have this one down cold. By the way, please read my emails about completing or recompleting the food court simulation. Well, I used to include this graph in my Unit 1 test. I'm not sure it was included in yours. At any rate, the Unit 2 test does include some review questions from Unit 1, including questions about price floors and ceilings. And these questions use this graph. So think about what would happen if, for example, the price were not allowed to drop below $10, or if the price were not allowed to rise above $2. Would the result be a surplus or a shortage? And how much? This is another case where a picture is definitely your friend. If demand is greater than supply, you have a shortage. Price ceilings cause shortages. If supply is greater than demand, you have a surplus. Price floors cause surpluses. How big a shortage or surplus is the distance between the quantity demanded and supplied, which is information you can easily get from the graph if you perform a little subtraction. So the test includes several scenarios where you have to identify whether it is demand or supply that shifts, in the direction it shifts, and the effect this has on price and quantity. In my experience, these scenario questions can be tough for students. You have a practice quiz that gives you lots of opportunities to hone this skill. If you haven't taken this practice quiz, I highly recommend that you do. Here's a reminder of what happens when there is an increase or a decrease. That is a shift right, that's an increase, or a shift left, that's a decrease in either demand or supply. But I really recommend that you not try to memorize what happens. Draw the graph and see what it tells you. Remember, pictures are your friend. Okay, this should be easy, but it's been a while since we talked about marginal utility. You can fill in the missing blanks from the information given, right? And here's a demand schedule that you will also see on your test. What happens as the price declines from 20,000 to 18,000? Is this a change in quantity demanded? In other words, is it a movement along the demand curve, or is it a change or shift in demand? What happens to total revenue when you move between these prices? How do you calculate total revenue at each point? Notice, by the way, that you're not getting especially tricky numbers. So what does this chart tell us about the elasticity of demand for automobiles, at least between these two price points? I've already said this, but to repeat, you will encounter several questions that test whether you understand the difference between a movement up and down the demand curve or a change in quantity demanded, which is caused by price, and a shift in demand, which is caused by changes in taste, income, availability of substitutes, availability of complements, etc. That's an increase or decrease in demand. So what happens to demand for a good today? Now we're talking about shifts or increases or decreases. If I expect to get a rebate next week, what happens to the price of a good if the price of substitutes increases or decreases? In other words, what happens to the demand for Snickers if the price of Milky Ways rises? What about complementary goods? What happens to the demand for milk if the price of cookies rises, assuming everyone always wants milk with their cookies? These, again, are all shifts or changes in demand, not a movement up and down the demand curve. You move up and down the demand curve when what changes? Price. So this is a production function table. When do diminishing returns kick in? What is marginal physical product at each point? Remember, marginal is the change, and what you get here are totals. By the way, do not memorize the answers for this table. In most cases, you're going to have different numbers on the test than you have in this review podcast. This is showing you the kind of problems you'll encounter. So, as you probably already realize, you need to understand both the concept of marginal physical product, what that means, and the law of diminishing returns. Keep in mind the difference, again, between diminishing marginal physical product and one that actually turns marginal physical product negative. You can still have positive marginal physical product, just like you can have positive marginal utility, even when they're declining. What might turn marginal physical product actually negative? Well, in my chocolate chip cookie factory, for example, if I hired so many workers that we just got in each other's way and reduced production, MPP could turn negative. This is a production function, a measure of the total output that can be produced with a given quantity of inputs. In this example, everything is held constant except labor. Make sure you know how to read this graph. Make sure you can calculate marginal physical product. Make sure you can figure out when the law of diminishing returns kicks in, and that you see when marginal physical product turns negative, and again, that you recognize that those are two different things. By the way, this is not the graph you're going to have on the test. The test graph, in my view, is actually easier to read, but it's similar. It looks like this. Note that your answers to these questions will be whole numbers. We are talking about quantities, not dollar amounts, so you don't need a decimal point. You don't need any dollar signs. You don't need any periods, just a whole number. I try to make the instructions clear. You really just have two kinds of entry answers, whole numbers for quantity and money answers, which are always given in the amount to round to the nearest cent. One additional complication, I am asking you when there are thousands or millions to insert a comma just to help keep the numbers straight. I make these instructions, I think, clear in the exam, but please read the instructions carefully. So you have some questions about determinants of elasticity. Goods are more likely to be elastic if they're luxury items rather than necessities. They're more likely to be elastic if they take up a relatively big chunk of a consumer's income, or if there are readily available substitutes. So what about advertising? Well, advertising is all about making substitutes less attractive, right? And what do advertisers want to have happen to the demand curve? Remember, they're not particularly eager to lower their price to have you move up and down on the demand curve, but they would be like to see demand increase. Remember, the tastes are determinants of demand. So if they want demand to increase, which way do they want the demand curve to shift? So here's another graph that allows you to calculate total revenue and elasticity. What happens to total revenues when the price moves up from $160 to $200? When the price moves from $40 to $80? Those may not be the exact questions you get. You also need to remember the total revenue test for elasticity. If a price decrease produces a total revenue increase, then the good is elastic. If a price decrease produces a total revenue decrease, then the good is inelastic. If price and quantity move by the same percent, though in opposite directions, of course, demand is unitary. In other words, at that point in the curve, a price change will not change total revenue. You're going to have several questions that get at this total revenue elasticity test from different directions. Don't try to memorize an answer. Check your understanding of the concept. In fact, the reason I include different basically very similar questions using different graphs and charts is I want to make sure that you really understand it and haven't just memorized how to read one particular chart. So here's a demand schedule that enables you to calculate total revenue. Once again, by the way, you will have different numbers on the actual test. I know I've warned that several times. So here again, you need to be able to calculate total revenue, and using this information, you need to be able to figure out if demand is elastic or inelastic between any 2 points. You remember that rule, right? Remember, too, that elasticity may change between different price points. It's not necessarily a linear relationship. It's also important to remember the relationship between total utility, marginal utility, declining marginal utility, and negative marginal utility. Marginal utility always begins to decline with the second unit consumed. I like this graph on the right because it makes that clear. But total utility will go up until we reach the BARF point, and marginal utility is not just declining, it is actually turned negative. Okay, you're going to get a cost table in the problem set section of the test that's similar to what you've seen on your cost quizzes, which I hope you've taken. But make sure you also understand the relationship between the various measures of cost. Fixed cost is what a firm has to spend even if it's not producing anything. So fixed cost is always the cost you have at an output of 0. It's very easy to find. The first thing you should always fill in one of these charts. Variable cost is the additional cost associated with producing more output. And the amount variable cost goes up with each added unit of output is marginal cost. Average total cost is just what it sounds like, total cost divided by quantity. And this means that you can always find total cost if you have average total cost and quantity. You just multiply. You also need to understand the basic cost curves, what they look like and why. The only cost that always goes up is total cost. Average total cost declines at first because fixed costs are spread across more output. Eventually, the law of diminishing returns kicks in, and average total cost starts going up. Average total costs are at their very lowest point where they intersect marginal costs. You can memorize that, maybe it's a good idea, but it also makes logical sense. Once marginal costs are higher than average total costs, the average is going to go up, right? Think, by the way, if this helps you remember, what would happen to average weight if the next person who walked in the room weighed more than the average in the room? And what would happen if the next person who walked into the room weighed less? It's really a similar sort of problem. So you had a virtually identical set of questions on your first cost problem quiz. Now, some of you have been exempted from that because it got messed up in one of the classes on Moodle. I really, really recommend that you take that again, or at least take the practice quiz. So the leases and property taxes are fixed costs, right? And the labor and ingredients are variable costs. Now, here's a question. Suppose I did not pay myself a salary. What kind of costs would change and what wouldn't change? Think about the difference between accounting and economic costs. So this too is a pretty simple cost table. What are fixed costs? What are variable costs? What are average total costs? This is another example of how I'm going to come at your understanding of these concepts with a lot of different examples. None of them I think particularly difficult. This too is a straightforward cost table. You should be able to calculate average total costs, marginal costs of moving from each batch of 100, etc. When are average total costs at their lowest? Let me repeat my earlier warning, the numbers will not be the same on the test. Okay, you haven't encountered an average variable cost curve, and you don't really need to worry about it for this test, except to answer an extra credit question. I'm going to give you a hint. Think about how you could use average variable costs to calculate fixed costs. Make sure you understand how to read this graph. You also need to know how to calculate total cost given average total cost and quantity. So if my average cost per unit is $2 and I'm producing 12 units, then my total costs are $24, right? It's as simple as that. This is the cost table from your practice quiz. It is not the one that will appear on the test. Now, I am not going to hand out copies of these charts. Sorry, but it's too tough to maintain test security. It's not hard to copy them onto scratch paper, and that's what I recommend that you do. You know the drill. Once you've filled in the blanks, you should be able to answer all of the questions. Follow the same money entry rules. No dollar sign, rounded to the nearest cent or hundredths place, no periods at the end. Well, now I've pretty much given you the test. If you have all of this down cold, then you'll do great. I still recommend retaking the practice quizzes. I will also be opening all of the cost quizzes as soon as they close at 4 p.m. on Tuesday, March 24th. That's probably today when you're hearing this. That way you can look at some of the multiple choice questions as well. And let me remind you, you do not want to take the makeup quiz for the second part of the cost quizzes. Also, if you miss the unit test, you must make it up by the last day of class before spring break. I do not want to be chasing down people to take the unit test within days before graduation. For those of you who did not submit a food court simulation or whose food court simulations answers were devoured by the Moodle beast, I really recommend doing this, but it's your choice. If the opportunity cost seems too high, well, at least you have learned a term for that kind of decision making in economics. Good luck.